So I would love to welcome Professor Onyango. He's here, right? Of course, yes. Welcome, Professor.
Good morning, habari zenu. How do I introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Joe Oloka-Onyango? Joe has been a friend for a long period of time, and we have had over this period very close intellectual and spiritual contact. When I say spiritual, I don't mean in any religious sense. By spiritual, I mean the depository of all those human values which are there in all of us. Joe has been a prolific writer, a human rights advocate, a critical human rights advocate over a long period of time. He directed the Center for Human Rights, Makerere, for many years. And he has written a lot. I will not go through all these writings, but just say that much of his writing has been on law, legal issues and related subjects, but always in the Dharma tradition. Maybe you want to claim it for Makerere, but in the Dharma tradition, in the sense of it has been within and in the context of social history. So, I would say Joe has kicked up enough dust, but the lion has not yet caught up with him. You remember yesterday's anecdote? More recently, I just saw with Godwin his book on the struggles at Makerere has come out, published by the Raja Press. I had the honor of reading it in PDF, but reading a PDF is not the same thing as reading a book which you hold in your hand, caress it, kiss it, and read it. It's there. This is the book which has come out. And when this book was with the publisher, I discussed with, we had a chat with the Raja Firoz Manji. I told him I wish that we had a similar book on Nairobi and a similar book in Dar es Salaam. Immediately he told me, Issa, can you suggest someone in Dar es Salaam? I was at a loss. Now, that shows the state we are in. Whom to suggest who would do a work like that? And yet we need it. We really need to document the historical struggles that have taken place on these campuses and to learn from these struggles. Today here, we have student and staff associations, and we were discussing these things. It's extremely important for our generation after generation to understand from where we are coming and what are the traditions. We were talking about culture yesterday. For me, culture is a terrain of struggles. What are the traditions? What are the cultures that have been built through struggles on our campuses, which we are losing, which are fast losing? So I'm very glad Joe is going to talk, and after that, I'll probably give you some background to the Dar es Salaam Declaration. He was very much involved in the Kampala Declaration, so I'll leave it to him. So without wasting more time, may I invite Joe, and I must say it's a great honor to give his keynote reflections. Karibu, Joe.
Habari za asubuhi. It's great to be back in one of my favorite cities, Dar es Salaam, after many, many years. I must confess I was a bit reluctant to come. Unlike many others who insist that they're retired but not tired, the reverse is true for me. I'm both tired and about to retire. I'm in the evening of my teaching life. I celebrated 40 years in teaching this year, and I think it's time to throw in the towel. Only the persuasive calls by Ngwanza Kamata and that force of nature called Issa Shivji forced me to change my mind and return to the trenches for one last final hurrah. I don't regret coming. Yesterday was very invigorating. I may even change my mind about retiring. Apart from the subject matter of my talk this afternoon, I also want to pay tribute to Dar for two other reasons. Dar, or more broadly Tanzania, gave us Julius Kambarage Nyerere, who, as you all know, studied at Makerere University, which is my university. And he was a Pan-African, of course he was a leader, but he was more importantly, a Pan-African intellectual of great renown. Dar also gave us Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, who graduated from your School of Political Science in 1970. He's been in power in Uganda since 1986. Unfortunately, Museveni is a gift I'm not sure Ugandans were very happy about receiving. Maybe this was a case, Issa, of unequal exchange. Nevertheless, I evoke the name of these two leaders as a telling illustration of how the fortunes of our two countries and of the scholars and intellectuals in them are so closely linked. You heard yesterday about the Dar debate. The Dar debate, the editor of the debate was Yash Tandon. The main protagonists of the debate, on one hand, of course, you had Issa, and the others. On the other hand, you had Nabudere, Omonyo Jok, etc., etc. So these were people that were Ugandans in Dar, but we regard them more as East Africans or Africans who kept that spirit alive. They came to Dar, they came back to Uganda and moved it along. So I hope that this conference can rekindle and revive the once thriving relations between the academic communities of our two countries, the academic and intellectual communities. The Dar es Salaam Declaration on Academic Freedom and Social Responsibility of Academics and the Kampala Declaration that I've been asked to discuss today. I notice in our materials only the Kampala Declaration, which I think was an omission. Maybe copies can be made of the Dar es Salaam Declaration. I think it would be very useful for members and colleagues to look at the Dar es Salaam Declaration. But I'm going to talk in summary about the two. One originated in Tanzania, the other originated in Uganda. The former, that is the Dar Declaration, was adopted in April. The Kampala Declaration was adopted in November of 1990. Both were primarily authored by the same individual, that is Issa. I have to say, Issa was in charge of the Kampala Declaration when we were in Kampala. At that time, I was just a young academic. I think I was a Kaladi. But it was great to sit at the feet of those giants of the African intellectual community. It was one of the first international conferences that I ever experienced. So I remember that time quite fondly. 33 years ago. 33 years ago, almost to the date, because it was November 1990. So while the author might have been the same, the institutional parents of the declarations were different. On the one hand, you had UDASA, University of Dar es Salaam Academic Staff Assembly. On the other, you had Codestria, who are our co-hosts this week. The Dar Declaration had 6 signatories, all of them being staff associations of the different institutions that came together to adopt the instrument. These included RD, which is now a university, the Cooperative College, I believe in Moshi, which also happened to be where Museveni taught. The Institute for Development Management, I don't know if it's still an institute or it's a university too. Institute of Finance Management, Sokoine University, and the University of Dar es Salaam. Those were the 6 founding charter members of the Dar Declaration. So you can see the founders of that declaration comprised a mix of traditional universities and other kinds of tertiary institutions, all of them public or created by the state. On its part, those who attended the Kampala Declaration, the Kampala Symposium, and adopted the declaration included academics, students, administrators, trade unionists, donors, members of civil society, administrators, drawn from all over the African continent, from the diaspora, the African diaspora, and a number of non-Africans. The Dar Declaration is divided into 6 parts. 1, on basic principles. 2, on academic freedom. 3, autonomy of institutions of higher education. 4, social responsibility. 5, ratification and association. And finally, on definitions. The Kampala Declaration has 4 sections: fundamental rights and freedoms, obligations of the state, social responsibility, and lastly, implementation. In order to provide some context for critical reflection, I've divided my presentation into 3 basic parts. First, I want to look at the broader history. I think history is fundamentally important for us to understand the present and the relevance of those instruments and why they were adopted. Then I will move on to consider issues that I believe are of contemporary relevance that were either covered by the declarations or were omitted by the declarations but are still alive today. And lastly, I'll make some concluding observations and remarks on how we can proceed from there. So let me begin with the history. 1990, I think you've heard, was in the early years of the post-colonial, post-Cold War era. In 1989, the Soviet bloc had disintegrated. Around the world, democratic change seemed afoot. In Africa, single-party dictatorships were falling. Only 5 African countries in 1990 had universal suffrage and multi-party systems. By 1995, those were now in a minority. The majority had transited to multi-party arrangements. At the same time, we were affected by the scourge of IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs. What did this include? Privatization, descaling public services, and the adoption of highly monetarist policies. As we heard yesterday from Bayo, this was the age of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. For universities, these policies involved cost sharing. You know, again, the euphemism. Let's share this cost. It's like a party. Come to my party. Let's share the cost. Staff retrenchment, the abolition of student allowances and downsizing, freezing on recruitments of academic staff and of administrative staff. It's the time in which the crisis in African education reached its apogee. So 1990 was a period of both considerable hope, but also one of great change, formidable challenge. In Tanzania, Mwalimu had stepped down 5 years earlier as founding president. Ali Hassan Mwinyi was in command right in the middle of his tenure in office. Agitation had commenced for the removal of the single-party monopoly exercised by Chama cha Mapinduzi. That's the Party of Liberation, still the Party of Liberation, in power today. 2 years later, Tanzania adopted a multi-party system of government. In academia, things were difficult. UDASA became more vocal in speaking out against the austerity measures imposed to change and restructure the economy. In Uganda, we were reeling from 6 years of civil war, 1981 to 1986, and nearly 2 decades of political strife. Museveni had been in power for only 4 years. He was still in the honeymoon of his successful guerrilla war. Ugandans and many other Africans loved him. He seemed to be a combination of Che Guevara and Patrice Lumumba. You couldn't say anything bad about Museveni. I was almost stoned in one lecture, saying something slightly critical about him. In spite of that popularity, one could discern traces of the autocratic governance. I think Willie told us the stories. So the autocratic governance didn't begin when he was in power, but even before. Indeed, you could tell that there was not something a little bit off. Now he's been in power nearly 4 decades. Indeed, we could say in hindsight that those times were just the beginnings of the dictatorship. Makerere, the only public university in the country at the time, was on fire. The first ever strike of academics in the history of the institution had just ended. Surprisingly, Kampala was chosen as the site for the first ever international conference on academic freedom, because, for some reason, the light in Uganda seemed to be more prominent than the darkness in many other countries. Now, given this history, the two documents are quite similar beyond the authorship, but there are also differences. Both instruments were broadly concerned with, number one, articulating the exact nature and character of the right to academic freedom as a subcategory of the broader human and democratic rights that belong to all human beings. Two, they were concerned with highlighting the specific struggles that African academics were facing in attempting to ensure the realization of the right to academic freedom. Three, they outlined the obligations of the state and of tertiary institutions in facilitating and protesting against the violation of those rights. And lastly, these were 4 broad objectives. Lastly, they were concerned with the relationship between the right of academics to freely teach, research, and comment on all matter of issues and their links to the broader community. In other words, it was not a navel-gazing exercise, academics looking only at themselves and concerned about their rights. Rather, it was a question of where does the academic and the intellectual fit within the broader community. So the rights of concern mainly were rights of organization, rights of expression, and rights of association. Structurally, the Dar Declaration is made up of 53 articles. Kampala Declaration has only 26. Perhaps the difference is explicable in terms of both the time available for the formulation, as well as the distinctive goals to which these instruments were devoted. The Dar Declaration to a local geospecific institutional reality. The Kampala Declaration was addressed to a much larger regional audience. While the Dar Declaration might have been local in focus, it was very much Pan-African in inspiration and global in conception. Global in the sense not of globalization, but global in the sense of looking at matters much more broadly than the geographical specifics with which they were concerned. Although the measures of privatization had already begun, it is true to say that the majority of representatives who participated in the formulation of both declarations, Kampala and Dar, came from state or public universities. I think in 1990, private universities were really a minority, which I think has changed, but I'll come back to that point. Also, much more of the focus of the declarations was placed on faculty, on staff, than it was on students. Again, that's something that we'll come back to in terms of our discussion. So these instruments were concerned about the everyday struggles of academics and intellectuals. Hence, they were not only key intellectual activist instruments in the struggle for academic freedom, but they fed into the broader struggles for democratization. I describe them as intellectual instruments because they are not only concerned with the ivory tower, but with the broader struggles outside. I'd also describe them as activist because they belong to the canon of radical rather than official or statist instruments of legality. So, for example, the Dar Declaration was influenced not by the Banjul African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but the Algiers Declaration. And everybody should get a copy of that Algiers Declaration. It's very powerful and very popular in its expression. So, this contrasted, for example, with the Lima Declaration on Academic Freedom, which was done by the World University Service. So you can look at the Dar Declaration. I just want to quote from it, just 2 sentences. These are times of crises, but they're also times of hope. As people's free and independent existence is in question, they're beginning to question the existence of unfree and rightless politics. Unfree and rightless politics. That's the opening phrase of the Dar es Salaam Declaration. And you can read the rest and see how it was invoking the spirit of the African quest for freedom. The Kampala Declaration stated, and I quote, African people are responding to these intolerable conditions by intensifying their struggles for democracy and human rights. The struggle for intellectual freedom is an integral part of the struggle of our people for human rights. Again, the rallying call made by the declaration is quite clear. In fact, the Kampala Declaration was declared just 6 months after there was a massacre of students at Lubumbashi University at the time it was called Zaire, now we call it the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this was when former dictator Mobutu Sese Seko was grappling with growing unrest to his autocratic rule. Ironically, only 2 months after the Makerere, after the Kampala Declaration was adopted, 2 Makerere students were shot dead by state operatives. So these declarations were really speaking to critical realities that were happening at the time. Finally, although written in conditions of considerable strife and challenge, the declarations sought to invoke hope. They invoked, in my view, adding now a theoretical dimension to this analysis, they invoked the struggle theory of human rights, that human rights are not given to you, that human rights must be struggled for. And I think this is the point that Issa was making in terms of the question of double standards, dual standards, the point of whose rights these are, the point of how these rights come into existence. There is no right. There is no right that comes into existence without struggle. And indeed, we need to go back to invoke the struggle dimension of those rights in order to recapture the space. In fact, the Dar Declaration stated, but rights are not simply given, they are won. Rights are not simply given, they are won. And it went on, and even when won, they cannot endure unless protected, nurtured, and continuously defended. You can look also at the Kampala Declaration. It makes similar invocations. In the wake of the 2 declarations, the reach of academic freedom has extended quite far and wide. This freedom is now recognized as more or less an established freedom. It's even extended to the continental level. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, in the case of Kenneth Good versus Botswana, explicitly recognizes the right to academic freedom. There are several constitutions. In the 1995 Constitution of Uganda, the right to academic freedom is explicitly recognized. 21 out of 55 African constitutions recognize the right to academic freedom. Hence, and all of these post-1990. So, to put it differently, the declarations, the Dar Declaration and the Kampala Declaration, have had a jurisprudential impact on the framework of addressing human rights. Perhaps a major failing of both declarations was in providing mechanisms for implementation of the critical elements of academic freedom which they propounded. The Dar Declaration talked of ratification and accession, which elaborated a threshold figure of additional institutions for the conferment of legitimacy. The next step after adoption was for staff associations to pressurize respective institutions at their institutions to give the declaration formal recognition. I don't know if that happened. Eventually, the government itself was to be approached to accord the declaration political acceptance. I don't know if the government ever did so. That's something we can come back to discuss. On the part of the Kampala Declaration, it called on the intellectual community to further elaborate and concretize the norms and standards in the instrument. So again, broad but short on an action plan, on a plan of implementation, on a plan of protecting the right of academic freedom, on a plan of enforcing the protection of the violation of rights to intellectuals and academics. All in all, despite the limitations of both time and place, I believe the 2 instruments represented a significant contribution to the struggle. In terms of the broader discussion about academic freedom. Secondly, I think the instrument provided an African perspective to an issue that had hitherto been viewed primarily through Western lenses. So those were the instruments. However, having been passed in the era BG, that is the era before Google, or the era BI, that is before the internet, how can these instruments address the many challenges and concerns of academic life today in 2023? 2023. And that's what I want to focus on now, having given you the background to those instruments. Now, although the two instruments were very explicit in addressing the ills of the day, many of the problems that they addressed continue to haunt us. Indeed, we can add new issues to the list. And I believe that my list is not exhaustive, but I'll give you my list. I'm sure you add to that list. This is what I want to talk about going forward, the issues of concern today. Some of them raised within the context of the two declarations, others that may be of concern now. One, the question of state control and dominance. Two, universities as sites of repression and microaggression. Three, privatization and the proliferation of universities, or the phenomenon of massification of higher education. Four, the question of sex, gender, and sexuality. Some of the discussion yesterday, I'll take it further. Five, the question of global domination and decolonial struggles. Six, what I call the post-pandemic academic blues. And seven, the question of implementation, or, to put it in Shivji's terms, on what is to be done. Let me talk about the state. Despite the decrease in outrightly fascist regimes of governance and the progress away from total dominance of the state of African universities that happened in the 20th century, the state, and particularly the phenomenon of undemocratic governance, is still a prominent actor in the life of many African universities. I could say without contradiction that the vast majority of African governments pay only lip service to the basic elements of academic freedom. They adopt a narrow perspective which recognizes the right to teach and the right to research, but disregarding and undermining academic freedom as a democratic and basic right. Let me put it differently. Once the deliberations at the university cross the university gates and enter the street, or the ghetto, or the village, or pass out on the radio, the internet, or the vlogosphere, the response of the state ceases to be benign. However, even what we may consider benign by an ordinary observer can be regarded as subversive, seditious, or even treasonous by the state. Hence, interventions by the state which offend academic freedoms continue even in 2023. Among some of the indirect methods deployed by governments include the following: using financial, fiscal, and legal incentives and penalties to influence research and teaching. I think Professor Hamoudi told us yesterday an example of the heat. Such measures are accompanied by bullying and threatening recalcitrant staff, even reaching the extent of instituting civil and criminal charges against them. States have also been involved in sabotaging, manipulating, or gerrymandering electoral processes for staff, student, and alumni organizations. female academics face what we call marriage and baby penalties, being compelled to make a choice between family and career. While elections have replaced ministerial or presidential appointments in many countries, several of them still control the selection of senior academic and administrative staff. In other words, government authorities still control who becomes a professor, who becomes a registrar, who becomes a vice chancellor, with numerous implications for the state of democratic action and mobilization on campus. The powers are used to secure the deployment of university management and governing councils in order to guarantee pliant or complicit state agents who ensure that the will of the government is done. At Makerere, let me give you an example. The chair of the University Council is the niece of the Minister of Education. The Minister of Education, by the way, doubles as the First Lady. Her son-in-law is the chairperson of the Appointments Board. I think it needs emphasis to state that the minister's husband happens to be the president, who is the visitor to the university. But those are indirect measures. More overtly coercive measures have also been recorded. Between September 1st, 2021 and August 31st, 2022, scholars around our continent have faced state-invoked attacks in countries, just a sampling: Cameroon, DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia, Guinea, Lesotho, Nigeria, and Sudan. Intellectuals have been arbitrarily arrested and imprisoned. They've had restrictions placed on their free movement. They face a panoply of legal and extra-legal measures affecting their academic freedom. At the same time, there was, and this continues to date, intrusions by non-state actors but who act like the state, including armed militants as well as extremist off-campus vigilante groups. In the wake of the Tigrayan uprising in Ethiopia, university scholars and institutions were targeted by both the Ethiopian government forces as well as fighters of the TPLF. Garissa University in Kenya, neighboring Kenya, you know what happened there. The Ahmed Baba Library in Timbuktu was raided by armed groups. Now, you've heard of Boko Haram. Although Boko Haram has largely targeted primary and secondary schools in northern Nigeria, universities have not been spared. So even as the universities in this region of the country soldier on, they're affected by high dropout rates and a reluctance of non-natives to study in the area. Academics are under tension. You can't just criticize Boko Haram, and so on and so forth. So taken together, the state remains a prominent violator of academic freedom. And I'm sure you have hundreds of examples from your own contexts. But let me move on to our universities, our dear, dear mother and father universities. I describe them as sites of repression and microaggression. So while the state loomed large in 1990 in both declarations, both were also concerned about the excessive control and domination within universities themselves and tertiary institutions. And let me say that today, in 2023, many universities, both private and public, are tormented by what I can only describe as the HRD. The HRD. What is that HRD? The human resources demon. That demon extends from making spurious rationalizations about downsizing academic staff to imposing ludicrous conditions for entrenchment, coupled with new methods of monitoring staff attendance and performance in class. In the case of Makerere, and I would really like to hear from other institutions, but we've got the latest managerial measure that is designed to both cull and cow staff, consists of the introduction of a biometric system of monitoring staff attendance. You check in at 8 a.m., you check out at 5 p.m. We have the president of the Mwasa here. I think he'll talk about it. I don't know if this exists in other universities. We're told this is best practice world over. You guys will tell me if that's happening in your places. But what does this represent? It represents a capitulation to the demand by the state that academics should be treated no differently than workers employed in direct government service, with all the varied implications that this entails. Security of tenure is no longer guaranteed, as universities have moved from fixed tenure to periodic contract and even piecemeal rate and adjunct relationships. The processes of initiating, renewing, and terminating these agreements are rife with all manner of machination, coercion, and unconscionable conditions. These methods of internal institutional collaring at African universities, in my view, amount to new forms of dominance and repression exercised from within. So the state now has a pliant and cooperative agent doing its bidding, all in the name of the HRD, all in the name of efficiency, the improved management of resources, and the pursuit of compliance with international standards of performance. Again, the neoliberal agenda manifesting itself right on campus. Needless to say, the ultimate result is academic self-censorship. When academics are unsure how much of what they say or uncover in the course of challenging the status quo, whether nationally, locally, or even within their departments and faculties, will come back to haunt them in the politics of academic growth and promotion. Because we've got to move up, right? From assistant lecturer to lecturer. If you start shouting at assistant lecturer, forget about getting to the lectureship. If you keep quiet until you're associate professor and wake up and start shouting, forget about the professorship. So while recognizing that the two declarations, Kampala and Dar, focused on external and structural factors, they were also concerned with the social responsibility of academics. This remains an issue today. And indeed, our responsibility still rings true, especially with respect to issues such as sexual harassment, the maintenance of ethical standards, moonlighting, neglect of teaching, mentoring, and supervisory obligations. So, the Dar and Kampala declarations still ring true. African academics, we need to reinvigorate our commitments to the pledges that we make to our students and to the wider community. These are responsibilities that we need to revive. Let me move on from universities to talk about the question of privatization and the proliferation. In 1990, as I've mentioned, the vast majority of universities in Africa were public institutions. And you can understand, you can see the tenure of the two declarations really focus on those two. The spate of privatization that spread across Africa was only just beginning. And the SAPs which were being pursued at the time had not yet really grasped the political economy. Now, while some of the rationale for privatization made sense in an economic sense, the policy was actually a thinly disguised entry point into a much worse process. And that was the process of commercialization, or what I would describe as the balance sheet approach to higher education, in which rather than being approached as receptacles of learning, students are viewed as commodities for capture. The larger the number, the higher the returns, regardless of the quality of education disseminated. The drive towards making the university entrepreneurial in the wake of reduced state funding has led, in my view, to the uncritical embrace of funding from business and external donors, neither of whom are necessarily altruistic or genuinely developmental. Is it of any surprise that the largest external donor resources in most African universities, I don't know what it's like in Dar es Salaam, but in most are directed towards funding areas such as public health? Why public health? Ebola, COVID-19, HIV, AIDS. You can list them and understand that these are not just local questions, they are international questions. Accompanying the above developments is the emergence of what I would call micromanaging administrators, who have become much more dedicated to superficial metrics of success, quantitative as opposed to qualitative outputs, and especially the ogre of artificial university rankings. Much more than they're concerned about protecting university autonomy, championing the rights of faculty and students, or protecting those who stand to benefit least from the neoliberal developments. What do we see from this? We see grade inflation. We see the assembly line production of graduates. We see all manner of paying short course innovation. We see an epidemic of schools offering a plethora of under and postgraduate classes for which there is scant national capacity for absorption. These impulses extend to attempting to influence curricular reform and even the type of research which is being pursued. There are also concerted efforts at divide and rule against African academic and intellectual communities, with a divide being pushed between STEM on the one hand, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics courses, and SOSA, social sciences and the arts, on the other. Under the pressure of privatization and in the name of revenue generation, as state subsidies to tertiary education have fallen, not only have public universities assumed models of operation that are more akin to business and commerce, their motives have become much more narrowly entrepreneurial than utilitarian. We have what Mamdani called scholars in the marketplace. So university education has become a commodity, traded on the market to the highest bidder. I will not talk about the massification of doctoral awards. I don't know if it's happening in Tanzania. But we have many doctors now from many fly-by-night and dubious organizations that are masquerading as universities, all because of this spate of privatization. Maybe they're genuine, right? Maybe they're genuine doctors. I don't know, but I've read some of those PhDs and I'm wondering what's happening. To make matters worse, what I can only describe as the dollarization of the academy has grown with a premium placed on courses that are relevant, in quotes, and productive. That's what we hear from our administrators and from the state. Teach courses that are relevant and productive. Don't teach these unproductive courses. Under that paradigm, the measurement of academic value is quantified much more in terms of ability to attract external resources than the advancement of science, inquiry, and debate. Ironically, even as university education becomes much more of a private commodity than a public good, intellectuals and scholars who operate in private universities face much more precarious conditions of tenure, as well as self-censorship. If only because their tenure is less secure. To speak of academic freedom when next month's paycheck is not guaranteed, let alone faced by strictures imposed by religion. Many of these institutions are religious. Many of them have ideological backgrounds. If you don't do you can't do it. If you don't do So those are serious questions that we face in these private institutions. Let me move on to the issue yesterday, which was raised, a bit of controversy by my friend Hamoudi. The question of sex, gender, and sexuality. Neither declaration paid much attention to issues relating to gender or sexuality, save for making broad statements condemning prejudice, supporting affirmative action, and taking note of the problem of harassment. As a participant in the drafting, I say mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. The above, or to translate from the Latin, I am sorry, I am really terribly sorry. I apologize for my little participation in that drafting, in that sense. Obviously, 30 years later, I've become, as the judges say, I've become what? I've become wiser. But the above were serious omissions from the two declarations, especially from the Kampala Declaration in which I was involved, where the debate at the Kampala Symposium on these issues were really serious and intense. It almost overturned the conference. But we failed to translate the debate into the declaration. Needless to say, and I notice when I look around the room here, these issues still remain. I see very few women. I see, the majority are us wazee wakazi. I think there's a big problem in terms of gender and youth, and both Cadestria and the school. I'm very happy that the principal, Madam, are you called Madam Principal? No. Eh? She's what? What is she? What's the title? Hamoudi is a revisionist. Mama Principal. Okay. I'm very happy that your principal is a woman, but quite clearly, Cadestria, your next conference, there must be a change in terms of the composition. Why do I say that? Because gender issues remain serious at the African Academy, and they merit much more comprehensive attention than we gave in the declarations. Such an approach to gender today would necessarily have to comprehensively tackle issues such as access and equity, opportunity and inclusion, sexual and gender-based violence, as well as issues to do with representation, voice, and the rates of attrition among both female students and faculty. Of course, added to the above is the much more controversial issue of gender and sexuality. And coming from Uganda, I'm sure you expected me to talk about this. Although ostensibly arenas of free thought and discussion, I would say that the levels of prejudice, intolerance, and outright hostility over these issues is quite frightening. Let's take, for example, Uganda's recently enacted Anti-Homosexuality Act. Whatever you think about homosexuality, I'll reserve my views about them, but my point is about academic freedom. In that act, there are express provisions which affect not only freedom of assembly and association, as well as rights to privacy and dignity, but also the right to hold opinions, as well as the right to receive and share information, both of which are the bread and butter of our profession. Now, not only did these provisions receive tremendous backing in our parliament, but not a single university staff association or students' guild made any comment with regard to that particular matter. In the immediate aftermath of the adoption of the AHA, seminars were convened at Makerere University and other campuses around the country to mobilize students in the fight against homosexuality. Under the law, similar meetings to urge action against homophobia would face numerous restrictions and even penal sanctions in the name of battling the so-called promotion of the practice. Now, again, like I said, leaving aside the issue of homosexuality as such, it needs to be underscored that the freedom of expression on issues both kosher and taboo, issues that are okay and those which are not, is the core of academic freedom. For academics who fail to speak out over the plight of other repressed minorities, they should be aware that it's just a matter of time before the guns will be trained against them. Indeed, on October 27th this year, our Uganda National Council for Science and Technology, this is the statutory body mandated with the research oversight function in the country, it noted inter alia, and I'm going to quote this, I hope you don't mind. Whereas government encourages research into any area that is crucial to human life and advancement, where a person involved in research detects that a crime under the Act was committed, he or she is required to report, and it is an offense if the person does not report the perpetrator to police. So I'll leave you with this. I think you know it, but I leave you with the poem by Martin Niemöller, who said, "First they came for the socialists, I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I'm not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." So, although in many respects the debate over gender and sexuality is definitely a consequence of battles fought in Western academies, in Western courts and Western religious institutions, it points to a much wider issue that we as African academics need to face, and that we as academics and intellectuals need to address in terms of what does this Trojan horse approach? Today it may be homosexuals, but tomorrow you tell me I can't research Joseph Kony and the LRA. The next day you will tell me you can't research the ADF, and so on and so forth. The next day you will tell me these cults are off limits. So what does that mean in terms of academic freedom? Let me move on to talk about the question of global domination in the wake of decolonial studies. Now, in the two instruments, the issue of external influence and domination was obviously apparent but only vaguely referred to. Donor-dictated teaching, research priorities, all these were of particular concern. Both declarations were largely crafted with the idea that they needed to address this question of Western monopoly of the research and teaching agenda in Africa. Today, aside from the usual foreign, mainly Western suspects with dubious interests and self-participated stakes, there's a new external actor. And I think Professor Senkoro told us about that new actor yesterday. In 1990, China was a blip on the scene of global political and intellectual discourse. 33 years later, China is a phenomenal international power whose actions on the political and economic scene have caused the Western powers particularly to be placed on tenterhooks. Invariably, there are also several implications for academic freedom and the relationship between African academies, Chinese institutions of higher learning, and of course the Chinese government. Taking the cue from our counterparts in the state, one notes the warm embrace on many African campuses, exemplified by the rise in academic cooperation between the two over the last 20 years. I think Professor Senkoro told us about the rise of Confucius Institutes. Today, there are 61 in 46 African countries. Now, while we may welcome the embrace with China, and China, there are definitely many good things that come from China, I want to leave you the question. In this Confucian embrace, are we substituting one imperial power with another? Are we trading in Washington and London for Guangzhou and Beijing? In other words, what is the benefit for us as Africa? And why is it not Kiswahili institutes that we are spreading out around? That's the question that we should be asking. The uncritical embrace of the Chinese Academy raises new questions about the decolonial project. Movements such as the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall initiative in South Africa and other student-led actions targeting outdated and neocolonial curricula bring to the fore the problem that we still are addressing in African academies, which is alien and arid contexts. We still give pride of place to the DWMs, the dead white men. And that has to change. African universities are the par excellence example of the continued sustenance of the colonial project. We need to change that. If academic freedom is to become a reality, then the decolonial project needs to be embraced much more wholeheartedly. Let me move on. 2 more points. Do I have much? Okay. I want to talk about the post-pandemic academic blues. Those of you who listen to music, you know the blues. They're sad music, but they have a message. So I'm saying we are suffering from post-pandemic academic blues in the African Academy. Tanzania is only one of a handful of African countries that never fully closed down in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic that afflicted the world in 2020. Uganda not only closed down, it also invoked some of the most stringent conditions of pandemic management. Actually, in my view, it was pandemic dictatorship witnessed anywhere in the world. Many other countries around the continent imposed restrictions which impacted directly and otherwise on academic freedom. I'm sure most of the countries represented in this room experienced some degree of restriction brought on by the pandemic. Whichever side we fell, today we're in the post-pandemic era, and I believe that has serious issues for academic freedom. In the immediate wake of the pandemic, academies in Africa were affected by sweeping university and library closures. The sudden shift to remote work, learning, and teaching, the onlineization of the academy, pure virtual conferences, or what we can describe as the Zoomification of conferences, and strict mobility restrictions for researchers and students. Correspondingly, the new methodologies for addressing the pandemic brought with them increased opportunities for the surveillance of research, for the surveillance of teaching, for the discourse within the academies. It also brought heightened possibility for sanctions, restrictions, self-censorship, and academic isolation. Obviously, there was a class dimension to this issue, as many African universities and students were affected by the obvious resource constraints involved in accessing and using data, computers, and other smart devices, all of which were compounded by unreliable supplies of electricity. However, even after the pandemic and its associated restrictions were lifted, the academy continues to be affected by the public health and commandist approach to learning left in its wake. It's not it's not untrue that online classes are great tools for instantaneous non-physical learning. Nonetheless, they can also be avenues for censorship, harassment, surveillance, and other forms of political interference by autocratic and authoritarian governments. And there have been cases around the continent where this has happened. Of course, and this goes back to the issue of the global, we need to address the question of big data, the question of algorithm hegemony, both of which have serious implications for academic freedom on the continent, given how much African academies are reliant on these foreign technologies. Coupled with all this is what I call the decommunitization of the academy, where with classes, meetings, conferences migrating off campus, the idea of a community, of an academic community, of an intellectual community in the traditional sense, connoting a space of vibrant, invigorating physical and intellectual contact, has been greatly affected. Community has been virtualized. And like the notion of friends and friendship on social media sites like Facebook, the very notion and meaning of an intellectual community has been reconfigured. And we need to address the implications of that development. Let me conclude. You just excuse me, I'll take a sip of water. I want to conclude with the question of implementation and the prospects for concrete action going ahead. The two declarations, as I've already pointed out, paid scant attention to the issue of implementation. Indeed, while, ironically, the declarations were available in Western academies, they were unknown in many African universities. Indeed, I would say the same problem persists today. I don't know how many African universities know of these declarations or give them any kind of prominence. So there's been no clear and consistent rearticulation of the basic tenets in these two declarations. So in my view, first course of action is to repopularize the declarations as instruments of relevance to our contemporary struggles. Relatedly, is that of the extent to which these instruments were supposed to play mobilizing roles. They were supposed to be instruments of mobilization. Yes, we adopted the instruments, but what did we do to translate those instruments into the daily lived existence of the persons that were most concerned by these violations? The problem with an absence of either process of continuous mobilization or mechanisms of follow-up is that neither universities nor states, who are the primary focus of concern, are placed under any pressure. We go back to my first point. There is no right which is given to you. You must struggle for that right, but having struggled for the right, you must protect that right. We struggled for the right, we failed to protect that right. So despite the fact that these declarations are now 3.5 decades old, I think we face a number of challenges. Number one, in some respects, in terms of implementation, these instruments have been overtaken by much later instruments. So in November 1997, UNESCO came up with a mechanism. Subsequently, that mechanism was endorsed by the ILO. Again, you can look at that mechanism. It's called the Recommendation Concerning the Status of Higher Education Teaching Personnel. And there are many issues around that recommendation, which for us as an African community, we need to address. In other words, is this for us? ILO joined on with UNESCO in order to address this question. Now, the importance, though, of the UNESCO Declaration is that there is a mechanism of follow-up, of reportage, and of implementation that we missed in our two declarations, and that today we need to think about when we go forward. You also have several, again, outside of Africa institutions, producing, for example, indexes of academic freedom. But again, are they addressing the African intellectual and academic concerns? So what do I conclude with? Immediately after the Kampala Declaration, I believe Kodesha established an academic freedom unit. I don't know. I think somewhere along the way, that unit petered out. It's my suggestion that Kodesha needs to go back to the drawing board on that unit, taking into account the developments which have taken place since the Kampala Declaration was decided upon. And that now we're living in an after-internet period. We're living in a period of differentiated technologies where we can take advantage of some of these spaces that have become more enclosed and less available. Kodesha's vast panoply of committed scholars and researchers and its cooperative links, I believe, need to be invoked. They need to be invoked. So by way of conclusion, I believe that we need to discuss the revival of an African mechanism for monitoring, for implementing, for ensuring the protection of academic and intellectual freedom on our various campuses. Again, we can't allow, whether it's New York or London, Beijing or Buenos Aires, to take over this initiative. We must bring it back home. We must take these declarations back to the people. Thank you very much.
I think Joe has given us a very comprehensive coverage of the two declarations, and I need not spend too much time. But let me first fix we are supposed to break at 11:15. We started late, so Gwanza, can we break at 11:15? Yeah? Okay. So let's start. Very briefly, Joe, you started with two gentlemen that Tanzania gave, Nyerere and Museveni. First, I don't like the comparison. Yeah. I don't know whatever Museveni we gave you, but you metamorphosed it.
We changed it.
So yes,
we changed in Uganda.
So also share the blame. So also share the blame. I don't believe in this idea that people are born what they are today. I don't believe in that idea. But it's interesting that some of the tendencies of Museveni were apparent even while he was here as a student. Twofold, particularly military tendency. And sometimes history is best told in anecdotes. I remember one anecdote where, in the Revolutionary Front discussions, certain couple, a white couple, was identified as CIA agents. So there was a discussion against socialism, that these people would sabotage our Tanzanian socialism. So what to do? Museveni and led Shivji, Tanzanian, their position was that the next morning they should surround their house, which was in the campus, and hand over these subalterns to the police. And the other side, on which were late Charles Kileo, late Katigaya, and myself, we argued that that was adventurous. You are putting too much faith in the state. First of all, you don't have evidence. And we would make ourselves a laughing stock. So when we came out of that meeting, we thought that that was the agreement. But no, the other faction went actually. It surrounded the house. Okay. And they did make themselves a laughing stock. The newspaper picked it up. What are these kids thinking of? You know? The police, of course, paid no heed to it. No evidence, nothing. So that militarist tendency. Another one was, Museveni wrote an article, East African Federation, that he wouldn't mind a Bismarckian to knock together East African Federation. Bismarck.
Bismarck.
Yes. And a freedom fighter from...
Blood and iron.
Yes. IANC wrote back. He says, what is this comrade talking about? You know, how can he see Bismarck as an example that you can force, through military force, you can bring out Eastern Federation. So, again, those tendencies were there. So, don't just blame us, but also what type of... But you are right. I mean, when it started, there's a lot of hope, absolutely. There's a lot of hope. The way it come to power and the kind of organs which they have established in liberation areas, you know, National Resistance Committees and so on. One could have built on them, and he was popular. He could have done it. But instead, of course, what happened in Mozambique, Frelimo, even where our liberation movements did not simply inherit the state, but were destroyed it, we re-adopted the colonial state structures. That's what has happened. That's something that we should discuss at some point. The second point, you refer to Algiers Declaration, 1976. I am 90% sure in all our law departments, international law departments, Algiers Declaration is not known. Absolutely not known. And yet, although it's a declaration of its time, but for me it's a model of what a mobilizing declaration instrument is. Okay? So, by the way, those of you who want to read it, it is as an appendix in the concept of human rights. It is put there as an appendix. The Algiers Declaration. And the Algiers Declaration, unlike all other declarations, talks about people. It starts with people. Not every person, so every people have a right, etc. I think Joe has covered very well the Dar es Salaam Declaration, but briefly the background was that, I don't know if Godwin, I'm sure he knows it, if you still have your archives and records. The workshop which adopted the Dar es Salaam Declaration was sponsored by CODESIA. CODESIA was just beginning some kind of academic freedom program, or maybe not yet. And Udasa appointed a committee. This was on the threshold of rampant neoliberalism. It was about to come. And we're also going through the crisis of cost sharing. And I believe it's around the same period that university was closed on Matusia. Okay? Yeah? Was it during the same period? This was the context in which the Dar Declaration was adopted. And actually, I was reading some of the provisions, and I found it extremely refreshing. they still make a lot of sense. For example, what Hamoudi said yesterday about the interference with the curriculum. Article 38, institutions of higher education shall be independent of the state or any other public authority in conducting their affairs and setting up the academic, teaching, research, and other related programs. The state is under an obligation not to interfere with the autonomy of institutions of higher education. So the process of curriculum review, etc., is within the institution, not dictated. Now today we are told certain things in the process of curriculum review. Why? Because you have been given money to do it. Money to do it. And this is the curse. If there's any curse that haunts us in Africa, it is so-called aid. The bloody aid is a curse. It's not a benefit. And throughout, that is what it has proved. And I don't know, again, what do you want to do? Funding proposal. You must get funds from outside. Even simple things we cannot do. Even to write a statement, you must need funding. And that is a curse. That's what makes them control. I have not read the full story, but this morning when I was coming, I read that 10 African governments have been given IMF loan, very big amount. But these states are the ones who do not support the popular resolutions on Gaza. Yes. So they are being rewarded. Guys, and I would really like to speak to our younger generation. Beware. We've written about it. We spoke from the rooftops. Not now, not yesterday, long ago. The curse of aid. In our time, as students, we used to read Teresa Hayter's Aid as Imperialism. Zito. Did you come across that? Aid as Imperialism. I am told, and Hamoudi has been in this, so he would be able to, that even today, recruitment of the staff, the bureaucrats from town sit on the recruitment. What the hell do they know about recruiting academic staff? And why? Because university service here is part of public service. They changed the law in 2000, and was it 2002 or something? 2012, something, They changed it. And I want to recall, when that proposal was brought to UDASA for discussion, I was almost a minority of one opposing it. I said, don't accept to become part of public service. This new term, public service, is actually what we used to call civil service. University service is not part of civil service. You regret it. Don't accept this. Even during the days of one-party state in parastatals, the parastatal regulation was supposed to be applied to the university, but we opposed it. We opposed it and continued with the tradition of how universities recruit, how universities teach, and the independence of the university. We became part of public service. Today, the head of the public service sitting in town can transfer an academic from this university to go and become Katibu Tarafa. Yes. Or to send to some other university. They have a say, the treasury has a say on the payroll. I am told that some people get promoted here, but they never get the pay of a promoted position because it has not been. That is a state. There are many ways of repressing universities. And Joe has pointed out this one. And we are not raising our voice. We are doing it as a matter of course. And the younger generation leadership in our faculties and schools, either they do not understand the traditions of the university, or they are too scared to talk, or they simply have it internalized neoliberalism. So they accept this as a matter of course. Repression. The Dyer Declaration talked about this issue of whole, again, in Article 40. No armed personnel, military or paramilitary forces, intelligence, and security personnel or forces of law and order shall singly or collectively enter the premises and grounds of institutions of higher education, except under the following conditions. A. There is clear, present, and imminent danger to life or property of the institution, and such danger cannot be averted without the intervention of the forces of the state. And B. The head of the institution concerned has invited such intervention in writing, provided that such invitation shall not be extended without consultation with and approval of a special standing committee of elected representatives of the academic committee instituted in that behalf. Academic space cannot bring in force of repression. Now we have a police station here. Okay? And there is no, I mean, we never, when this is done, we say, oh, we must have law and order on campus. We must have law and order. They carry on fantastic brutality, including sexual assaults, under the name of law and order. We know what our police are, right? We know. And there are times when people feel, I think yesterday someone made a point, are scared of fearing of talking because they are not sure who are in the present in the classroom. Sometimes you see very strange faces attending your lectures. And you're not sure who they are. Of course you know who they are. And therefore you don't talk. What academic freedom that you are talking about? I will not go much into that. Let me say something about homophobia. You'll be surprised in our societies how this issue is talked about. All generations across the spectrum. First, without realizing, people are trapped into a discourse, into a narrative generated by the state to divert attention from real issues of the day. And research discussion in this country on homophobia are precisely meant for that. Secondly, please, study history in your cultures a bit more. This is un-African. Why? Because West is telling you that. Sexual orientation, sexual relations in our society, in our culture, were a matter for the individuals, for the private ones. It was not a question of public. Read Abdul Razak's novels. There is no novel in which you do not get this. And finally, whatever your views may be, how can you not stand up and defend the very basic integrity of a human being, regardless of what she is or what is her sexual orientation? So I think this has to be talked about. I know. There is a lot of fear because of the cultural backlash and so on. But we must find ways. Sometimes it is important for intellectuals to take certain risks, to say things, even to our communities as they are. Of course, you must do it in a way which will not get alienated. But our communities are full of prejudices, man. They are there. Cultures are not innocent of prejudices. So I think these issues that you raised are important. Finally, on the Confucius Institutes. My view is that the rise of China is providing us with some space, with a niche. From the time when we had a single superpower, and that hegemony. Now the question, how do we use that space? Both as countries, nations, etc., etc. And the same thing applies to universities. Look, on this campus, I don't know much about it, but on this campus, Chinese brought Confucius Institute, but they also built an excellent library. An excellent library. Okay? Have we managed to put books in that library? Do our students go and read in that library? No. Instead, I think the much used of library is that hall, that the Chinese built. Because Chinese have this, everything is big. This big hall, which used for all kinds of conferences and bring state guests and so on. But they also built it. It's for us to choose. So it's for us to choose. You could have said no to Confucius Institute. Why don't you do that? Okay? We could have set the agenda of what we want. We want an Indian Ocean Institute. Right? We should set the agenda. Not there. And by the way, Confucius Institute are not only in Africa, they're also in the West. Yeah. They're also in the West, in American universities, in Canadian universities. Only about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was attending a conference of Journal of Peasant Studies in China. Again, as I said, China is organized big. Something like 55 countries represented, over 1,000 delegates, a very rigorous 4 to 5 days conference. Very good. One thing that surprised me, the Chinese scholars, meticulous researchers, Chinese scholars, Chinese universities, meticulous researchers, fluent presenters. And people spoke freely. There's only one bar. You don't talk about Communist Party. And you could see. So I'm saying that if you want to imitate, then there is something good also to imitate. Why are you always yes, we just tunaiga too. We are never innovative. Why? And that was not always the case, Jamani. That was not always the case. Learn from our own history. This campus was one time recognized in the whole of Africa, even in the world, of what it was doing and what it was producing. And the new ideas that are flourishing. So it's not always the case. So let me not continue because I think we should have some discussion. So we have about 20 or so minutes for discussion to get your reactions. But these are the issues that I think we should constantly be talking about and continue. And by the way, I endorse all the recommendations that Joe has made in regard to what CODESA can take this forward. And I think CODESA will have to play a role in this. CODESA will have to play a role in this. Because, guys, I think I want to tell you one thing. That this is the only Pan-African organization that has survived, and now it's celebrating 50 years. And that is achievement. Just a survival. Just a survival is an achievement. And we should not let this institution die. And I think the institution should now take on its role that it has played previously. I know in between there was a terrible break, and you went all become very liberal and so on. It's the liberal virus that Samir also talk about. Don't be infected by the liberal virus. Okay? Don't be infected by liberal virus. We are talking about committed scholarship, committed intellectuals. And we have a Pan-African agenda, Asanteni. Please, Thank you. Let's have your comments and comments. And don't feel constrained, please. Say anything, freely. Yes. Shall we start unusual, because from right to go to left. I usually start to the left. Okay, let's start. Hamudi.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. I said this yesterday, maybe I should say it again. We need to do a lot of empowerment of the youth at universities. I don't know the situation in other universities in Africa, but for the University of Salaam, we still have some way to go. So in terms of the declarations, you'll be surprised, they will not be known by, even amongst members of staff. It's very clear. So maybe revive that, and revive it from, and don't worry about the people coming to monitor you in class, etc., etc. Some of us are doing it. We teach. In the process of teaching, we also bring in these aspects. Maybe it's because of law, but we do this quite a lot. With experiences, I've been dean for the past 7 years, and Professor Shivji, when you made reference to a dean of law who did not give you audience when you came with Willie, I had already left. But I'm not saying the current dean.
You were not the dean at that time.
I was not dean at that time.
No, you weren't.
Yes, but the challenge is, in terms of the control, state control, there has been a circular issued from the state to management of the University of Dar es Salaam and other universities that no visitors at all should enter the premises of university anywhere without passing through protocol. I was seeing one of the protocol officers, he's left. So wherever you make an application, wherever you have somebody, you go through them. I never did that at all. I remember a number of people coming to the dean's office straight away, and I would say, you're here, and we'll proceed, including in the lectures at Mikocheni. We invited people, and they continued giving their. So there's a problem of state control. There's a circular, it's formal, and you're told you must do that. So what you could do, you rebel. You don't do it. I never did it.
Yeah, there you are.
I never did it. In terms of, again, state control experiences, we do not have biometric, but we have a bureau. I think some of them are here. It's called the Quality Assurance Bureau. They look, right now the lectures have started, so they would come into class and start looking at where you are. They will say, you must teach. You must appear in the lecture room. And if you don't appear, they come with a report later on. So I've been here. I've not attended the lectures. But I've told them, we know how to teach. And I've been teaching way before even these other people came. So what I do, I tell them, students currently are struggling to find accommodation. They are trying to find their ways into the campus. We know all this. So if you go to the lecture, you'll find 2 students. And they're telling us, even if it is 2 students, you must appear. So they are behind your back. No biometric. In law, we're very clear. We don't teach the first week. We teach by giving assignments. That's how we've been doing it. For a lecture that commences, you give them some work, and then they'll continue. They'll report maybe after about a week. And maybe you'd say, this particular assignment will be graded, etc., etc. But the introductory lecture, in terms of reading, you give them enough time to read. That is the academic freedom we want. Here, they are not saying anything. I've never attended. They have never written to me anything. When they write, that is my response. Or how to teach. Other experiences, in terms of your, I like to add HRD, Human Resources Demon. We have vetting. No, before I go to vetting, if you look at the university letterhead today of the University of Dar es Salaam, have you seen it? It starts with, not the University of Dar es Salaam, no. The Ministry of United Republic of Tanzania, Ministry of Education, Science and Technology.
Yeah.
Pardon? And that's why I came. If you had put the letterhead, I'd have gone to town. Yeah, the way it's structured, maybe colleagues don't know, you start with the United Republic of Tanzania, Ministry of Education, Science and Technology, and then you put the coat of arms on your left, and then the University coat of arms on the right, and then you say University of Dar es Salaam. A very small little one. So if you're not careful, you can think it's happening now. It's a department. So that is one. Secondly, vetting. Vetting, I have been in management of the University of Dar es Salaam, different posts for the past 29 years. I was also Daruso leader when we were thrown out in 1991. On the guise of that we made some words that were not very happy, the president was not very happy, and we skipped a year, and I'll come back to later, slightly later. And I was with Adolf, the Minister for Education today, who is now overseeing the state control of a university where he was a member of UDASA during that time. I'll come back to that later. So in terms of vetting members, heads, I'm aware, 100% heads of departments, principals, there is a procedure, they say we are searching. And then when the names come out, they go to State House to be vetted. And I have evidence of that. And we are told, we went to the training and we are told, the names cannot be announced now because they are going through the vetting process. And in that induction course that we went for members of staff and leaders of people from the forces came, anti-corruption, state security, to give lectures on how we should behave and that they are monitoring and overseeing us. And I just told one of the members of staff, colleague, management, I said, no. On this program, this should be the last person. Otherwise, law, head of department, dean, we will leave this workshop. We're not here for that. And then somehow we managed to avert that. But Professor Noe, you were there. You saw it happening. I made a quick joke about Mama Principal. Just a quick reference. But here we call our president Mama. Mama Samia Suluhu. We never called Magufuli Baba. So that is so principal, Mama Principal. It is respectable, but in a cultural context. Transfers, Professor Shivji, transfers and recruitment, it's correct. In the recruitment exercise, we have people from the civil service who come and even want to ask their questions. Where we come from, law, we said no, I was dean, and we made a precedent, no. When you come in, you have no locus. And we make sure we have the recruitment process. When you want to recruit a member of staff, you announce it on public, and then they tell you, now we have vacancy, and then provide for how they will vet. They will start seizing them off, sieving them through, and then after a while, they'll say now there will be interview sessions. So they come in for the interview sessions, and they want to take control. And they actually they provide points. They can overrule academics. They have questions from where they've come from, and they want to impose those upon us. In law, we've never allowed. They come, they watch, we proceed. After that, we collude to outvote them. And we target the people we want. Those are the strategies you have to take through. So transfer of lecturers from other units, there are very many of them, principals, heads of departments have been taken into town to places where they were never consulted and they've been told to leave. We are required to have travel permits going outside Dar es Salaam. A colleague of mine stays in Kibaha. So I was asking the vice chancellor, what happens when I was dean? So what happens to this lecturer who stays in Kibaha out of Dar es Salaam? So Majamba, no. For every rule, the exceptions, we're not applying that rule. So sometimes you really have to be a little bit problematic, and you will not get liked for that. The last issue I want to discuss and put it clear in perspective, the HEAT project. The HEAT project is for a 5-year project. The university has got, it's all on the website, for $47.5 million for advancing, among other things, you got it right, Issa, upgrading programs, also improving pedagogical methods, online, encouraging online teaching with the dangers that you are pointing out, and improve clear working conditions. We are also setting up different centers in other places. But most important, upgrading curricula. And this one has started, and they're telling us what to teach. what to teach. What to teach? We are doing it today. Tomorrow we are doing for the ballet program, but fortunately some of us are there and we are trying to control. I don't know about other units. It is disastrous. There could be advantages, but it was an agreement between the government and the World Bank, not the University of Dar es Salaam, the World Bank. And in that meeting, this is very important, the person who signed the agreement on behalf of the government was a PS of Minister of Education, who was a former UDASA chairperson, Dr. Francis Michael. The name is public.
I need to sit down as well.
And the guest of honor was no other than Professor Adolf Mkenda, guest of honor from the University of Dar es Salaam. Also an UDASA member, very actively involved. And he's one of the persons who was arrested. The other day we talked about the 1 week he was caught up when we were there. He disappeared for 1 week. We went to State House trying to look for him. We also disappeared, Kamata. We didn't come back again. When we got back again, they were asking us, so what is happening? The Honorable, the ex-president, Mwinyi, called us over, and we told him the whole story. The story was not about the manner in which, or rather the words that people used, Matusi Yangoni, that we said abusive language to him, etc., etc. We explained, and when he told him what to do, he said, cost sharing, and he said, hey, Professor Lipumba was the economic advisor of Mzee Mwinyi then. He was on the table there. Lipumba, Professor Lipumba, Zito Kabwe, unamjua? He was there, and he was telling me, I was making the presentation, Majamba, what do you know about economics? There's no law here. I was in third year, just about to graduate. And then the other person asked me again, why are you worried about cost sharing? You'll have left. And then when President Mwinyi had that, he said, but I think Professor Shivji then, Dr. Shivji was a minister, Professor Lipumba, I think they have a point. These people, if they go and maybe think about it, I'm an old man, they are my sons and daughters, if they apologize, I will consider it. We got back, we went to Nkrumah Hall, and the decision was, yes, let's struggle, finish, and then come back. Some of us said no. The leaders were required to write letters to apologize to Honorable then President. One person refused, a colleague of mine, Mbatia. Mbatia said no. Apologize for what? Mbatia was in fourth year, engineering, just about to finish. We were all about to finish. So university was closed. We were rusticated. All of us went home. We came back. Management. Now, 50 years UDSM celebrations. Now, this is the final word I'm saying. 50 years, the management was compiling a list of graduation ceremonies that have been held in this university for the past 50 years. When it came to 1990-91, there was no data. This was a very important event. The university was closed. Nobody graduated. And they grappled and tried and everything. Then they said, Sasa, we are in trouble. Why am I saying this? Because of history. They don't even know about what happened. So they said, you know what happens? No. Now on this one, maybe call Majamba. He must know something about it. So they called me up. And then I laughed. One person called me. I will not mention him, but he called and said, we are trying to compile this data, and in the process there is no graduation. You cannot get this. You used to be, I was a Senate member from 1988 when I joined first year until when I left last year. So for 29 years, I was a member of Senate. And I would remind them, I'm the oldest serving member. Then all representatives of students, leaders, were members of Senate. I was a representative since first year. When I left, went for university, elsewhere. When I got back, I joined management. And by virtue of the positions that I held, I was in Senate. And I have all the documents and the minutes. So they say, this guy knows. Maybe he has the minutes and the records. I just told them simply, you don't know the history of this university. There was no graduation. And I was one of the people, and other people were evicted. So don't look for those records. They are not there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. John Mahugija from chemistry department of this university. I'm also the chair of UDASA. I just want to make one point regarding implementation of the two declarations. As it had been pointed out, it appears that it's a big challenge. And I was wondering, because these two declarations were established in 1990, but if you read most of the acts which are applicable to academics, you don't find much about key issues on academic freedom, like the Universities Act of Tanzania, enacted in 2005. You don't find such key issues on academic freedom. So I was thinking that one of the strategies which can be very useful in terms of implementation, instead of just relying on these declarations, is to ensure that the key issues on academic freedom are incorporated in such acts. And that can be very useful. Otherwise, it's very difficult to rely on declarations, as some have mentioned that most people are not aware and they are not even interested, because these are just declarations. So at least if some key issues can be incorporated in acts or laws or other useful instruments, that can be very useful. Thank you very much.
Asante, Issa. Good morning. 2005 and 6, after the Universities Act came out, and there was a requirement that all universities, because the University of Dar es Salaam was established by an act of parliament, I don't know what, ago. But then when the Universities Act came, all universities had to have a charter, a university charter. So they have to be chartered. And we started a process, not that we, no. The management started a process of developing a charter without the knowledge of the members of academic staff. And our chair was in a council meeting which was about to adopt a new charter. And he raised a hell in that meeting, saying that how can we adopt a charter which nobody in the university community, apart from the management, knows about. And the council gave some room for members of academic staff to have a discussion on the charter, but it was a very short time, that we are given like a day or two. But anyway, we managed to delay that process. But to make a long story short, that in when I was involved, because I was in UDASA. Our chair was Chachage and others. Saida was the deputy chair. She is not here. So what we managed, and I'm not sure if it's still there was a small paragraph that was included in the University of Dar es Salaam Charter on academic freedom. We had to draft. Actually, what happened is that in the pushing for a charter that has, from our perspective, we even wrote our own university charter. And the two then we are standing side by side. Our charter and the management's charter. And that went on, including who was to be appointed as a vice chancellor. There were a lot of struggles going on. And one of the things that I would like to share, the charter, part of the provision in the charter created positions for people who were already in the management. Like they considered of, after the outgoing vice chancellor, who is going to be the vice chancellor, who is going to be the deputy vice chancellor, 1, 2, 3, 4. They had these 4 positions of deputy vice chancellors, which are still there now, yeah, I think. But then we intervened and we changed that. They adopted a few things, but I think later on they have smuggled them in back as also some of the things that were resisted. So what I'm trying to say that there is a small provision in the University of Dar es Salaam Charter on academic freedom, if it was not removed, because I'm not aware of the current state. That's the situation. Yeah.
Thank you. So, last Sadiq, at the tail end, under the chairmanship of Shivji, the original charter was drafted by 2 members of
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe, for a very interesting presentation. It's a very critical reflection of the declarations. But I would think that as one of the speakers said earlier on here, that these declarations do not have a legal status as such. They are aimed at establishing like maybe an academic kind of tradition or customs that might influence maybe legislations in domestic contexts. So I would think that apart from the initiatives by maybe universities in each of these countries, there is, in terms of having an enforcement mechanism, it's very important to have an enforcement mechanism at a continental level, or maybe at least at a regional level, let's say East Africa, having a kind of a systematic system of monitoring and evaluation of the implementation or respect of the provisions that have been enacted in these declarations. So I would think that if there is, like, for example, at least a review after every 5 years, say, comparing universities across Africa, or at least in the regions in East Africa, having scores or index reflecting their degree of academic freedom, I think this, at least a kind of naming and shaming, might help to motivate maybe these universities and maybe to try to pressurize the host governments to enact legislations that could be in conformity with the spirit of these declarations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mondo. Yes, Jakumi.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that wonderful presentation. I just have a few comments. One is about the human resources demon, which is real, and the massification of degrees and doctoral awards, which I want to present a blend that is likely to present genetically modified professors in universities. Yes, this is real, where some people, if someone finds their way fraudulently to acquire a doctoral degree, then be sure that they will also find their way to become professors. And once such people creep and they are at the helm of institutions, they are actually the #1 agents of repression in universities, because they know they have demons in their closets. They will use repression to make sure that they remain safe in such kind of position, and we are heading there. Number 2 is about the politics of promotion and appointment. I'm a victim as a leader of a staff association, and when you say it like that, I feel poked. For 3 years with a doctoral degree, I hold the lowest position in a university, and my only crime is telling the university management the truth and taking them to court for doing wrong things. And Yeah, so I know what this means, and it's real, but we must always find ways of addressing this. Then the gender parity. Prof, you talked about the design of this room. I would imagine the selection of this was purposive. And if it is purposive, for example, if I'm doing a study and I'm doing a selection of chief administrative officers, I will not dictate who is the chief administrative officer, but I'll pick a chief administrative officer, right? And now, what tells this is that the working environment of unions and associations is a little bit toxic, that most people find, most women find it to play safe, to remain in a certain zone. And I remember in 2019, the whole Makerere University Academic Staff Association executive was for men. They were men only. And Dr. Stella Nyans had to attack us and say, look at all these, I don't want to use that word. So you know the language he uses. So it's not by design, but it's rather the environment that unions and staff associations work in that is actually creating this. And if we are to address this, then we must first build on the basic tenets of academic freedom. Then, of course, there is the point of implementation, which I want to raise in line with my predecessors, the former speakers. East Africa has the Inter-University Council of East Africa. How does, for example, Codestria work with this council to make sure that, first of all, we have a very good working relationship, but also to ensure that institutions that are members of the Inter-University Council of East Africa become the first point of respecting academic freedom? Because I find it strange that members of the Inter-University Council of East Africa are the forerunners or are at the front line of suppressing academic freedom. But from the overall, when I take a note of these two declarations and Joel's presentation, I note that universities have not changed locations, but they have changed the direction. And it doesn't necessarily mean that this direction is correct. And it's important that we constantly reflect on the directions of these universities and redirect them to the right direction. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you. With your permission and democratically decided, I will give Godwin last few words and then go back to Joe because, sorry, unless... Okay. As an organizer. Yes, please.
Yeah, Joe raised this issue of the gender parity or imbalance in the people who are in this room, and he was pointing it to Godwin. I think should point it to us. Because we were responsible in identifying participants, and the basic criteria we agreed was to invite staff union and the students association representatives. And the unfortunate thing is that the composition, and he just said it, the composition of the leadership of staff union and the students association, the top is men. Presidents, at least you call them guilds. You are the president, or you are president. You see, there is also a difference, students associations have presidents, and the staff association has chairpersons. So most of the presidents from students association are men, if not all of them, except Marvin, I'm not sure. But the vice presidents will be, at least from the experience of this university, are females. and we try to invite some of them. And some, I don't know if they are here. I saw them yesterday. From Muhimbili, there is a chairperson who is a female. So that's the source of the problem. So probably if there is going to be a next colloquium, not here or anywhere, we should be conscious of that and probably deliberately consider identifying female participants so that you can also get their own experiences. Part of it has been touched by the chair of Staff Association of Makerere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just for the record, I have been teaching the two declarations, and it is to graduate students from different African universities. I have never met a student who had encountered it in their undergrad. So that's just for the record. And they come from different disciplines, so it's always interesting for me. But the question I wanted to ask was really Joe and maybe Issa, if you could comment on this shift from academic in the use of the word academic in Kampala, and then the insistence on intellectuals in Kampala. And it seems we have gone back to talking about academic. And I think there are important implications based on whether we only want to focus on academics or whether we want to talk about intellectuals or whether we are deciding here that you must be an academic to be an intellectual.
Why am I happy that that's not directed at me? No, but I just wanted to really sincerely thank you, Joe, for two things. One, for a very, very illuminating intervention on this topic. And two, for agreeing to the persuasion of Kamata and Issa. Because we will have a discussion separately. Because I had also targeted you for this particular meeting. And there's a reason why we really, really have to listen to you. There are three people whose names come out prominently in any discussions on the Kampala Declaration. And all of you are slightly younger than the cohort of Codesria people who organized the conference. Actually, it might be that it was at that conference that Wangari Maathai attended the first and last meeting organized by Codesria. And for her to attend the meeting, Thandika used to tell this story. She had to escape the Moi machine by driving all the way from Nairobi into Western Kenya and crossing the border unnoticed. So she arrived at the venue days after the meeting had started. And Amina Mama does make this point in a publication that she's just submitted. The challenge of putting the gender agenda in the Kampala Declaration, and consistently mentions the supportive work that you and Paul T. Ambezeleza played. So your apology is accepted on account of the fact that you played a positive role in this. But perhaps for me most important is that I do appreciate the need to speak to younger academics, encourage them to think a little more positively about academic stroke intellectual freedoms. But I feel like we shouldn't leave the suggestion that this problem begins now, right? Ali Mazrui could debate Akeno Dok in Amin's Uganda on national television on a range of topics, right? How many countries in the region in Africa can you have a similar debate under a dictatorship, military dictatorship? And for me, it's a representation of how far back we have gone, right? And Mazrui writes about this in his book, Political Values and the Educated Class in Africa. And the point I'm really working towards is the more difficult challenge. I feel like it's slightly easier to deal with the state that is subverting academic freedom because it's predictable. It's more difficult to deal with academics who are subverting academic or intellectual freedoms. There is absolutely no way beer in Cameroon would be surviving today if it's not the role of intellectuals and academics. And a friend of mine telling me that in his own private spaces, he says, this is Paul Biya, he says that where there are 3 Cameroonians sitting, I'm not worried because one of them will tell me what was being discussed. So he relaxes and takes it easy. But also from the Codesria perspective, sitting in an executive committee meeting, I won't say when so that you don't track me, and citing, I have already made a presentation about revitalizing the academic freedoms program to the Codesria Executive Committee. And they have adopted some of the suggestions that you put at the table. And members of my executive committee are literally disagreeing that there are no academic freedom problems in their countries. Right? Sitting in Codesria, the institution that is supposed to be pioneering around these questions. Okay? So it's more difficult to deal with academics subverting academic freedom, I want to say. And I want to conclude, Issa, on the point that Joe, the suggestions that Joe made around repopularizing this. And I'll say this, I'll say it tomorrow. We've had extended discussions with the principal. And we feel that the genius of the Dar es Salaam Declaration was that it was colleagues in the University of Dar es Salaam self-mobilizing and forcing Codesria to listen. And the problem today is that all of you are waiting for Codesria to lead. And we have a whole bunch of priorities that by the time we get to academic freedom, either we are tired or we don't have the money. Right? So the challenge for me is not that Codesria should do what everybody thinks. I think different regions of the continent should self-mobilize in the manner in which Dar es Salaam Udasa organized itself and forced Codesria to respond to a question that was pressing. Okay? And if we do that, part of the suggestion that I would put at the table, especially for Eastern African region, is going to be that the University of Dar es Salaam becomes a focal point around which our initiatives on this issue are being discussed. And I wanted just to mention in response to Mshai's question that originally we had intended this to be academic freedoms and popular struggles. Because we think that in the context of popular struggles, intellectuals are leading that part of the. So the nexus becomes almost automatic, right? But for different reasons, we ended up here. So the point is, push us to respond. And we definitely are going to respond.
Thank you. Thank you, Gauri. About academics becoming themselves supporters of academic freedom, we have that experience here. Because there was a time when administrators, management were appointed from outside and they were not academics. So we fought for it. And academics became in the management, DVCs, VCs and so on. They proved to be worse than the administrators to this day. I think I'll now leave it to Joe to answer some of the questions and then we can wind up.
Okay. Thank you very much, Issa. And thank you for all the comments. It really, what strikes me is that it's very clear that there's a momentum for us to move forward, whether it's at a regional level or at a continental one. But I think there are two things in terms of moving ahead. One, we must make that reconnection that Mshai is talking about between the academics and the intellectuals. Because really, in both Dar and at Kampala, That was very clear about that breaking the ivory tower. Getting out of that ivory tower and saying, look, academic freedom is not us, right? It's not a right that just belongs to us, but you must contextualize that right. That right can only thrive if the wider context is operating. Now, of course, that then now, the nature, if you wish, in terms of Godwin's, the enemy within. The enemy within. How do we address the enemy within? I mean, I think part of the question is, for every kind of situation, I would suggest that sort of a three-step process. The steps, vigilance first. The vigilance, without vigilance, these processes will never be exposed. 2, organization. What's the state of our organizations, especially in terms of our academic association, our guilds, the students' guilds, and how much are those organizations connecting with the broader institutions of popular society? And lastly, action. So we can't begin with the action. We must begin with the vigilance, the organization, and then we decide on what action to take. And I would agree that probably starting at the regional level would make sense, and thinking about, because maybe in terms of the academic who said, well, in our country we don't have problems, maybe this is a bad sample here, because the problems here, sound like they're really tremendous, right? And I don't know. I mean, I have some familiarity with regions other than East Africa, and I don't know if you're telling me Cameroon, they don't have those problems. You're telling me Togo doesn't have those problems. You're telling me even the great Senegal doesn't have those problems. Surely, I think that there's either a misinterpretation or a misrepresentation, one of the two. And also in terms of striving by example, maybe since we've had this conference here, we ride on that momentum. We ride on that momentum before you try to bring others on board. Because the small is better to start with the small than to start with the big and hope for, So I would suggest, or I would support, I think the suggestions by the gentleman at the back. Just tell us your... Professor Mohammed. One, of course, there's the question of legal status, right? Again, it's the question of vigilance, right? Where are you when these things are happening? Kamata told us about some of the processual things. But you have to be prepared. You know that these guys are always working. They're always deliberately working to see how much they can decrease your rights. They're not asleep, right? So for us, we've got to be awake to work on how we should work to expand our rights. Always, okay? Always. We must progressively be working to expand those rights. And I would say 2 things. One, of course, I think there needs to be a periodic review of those statutes, charters, instruments, even the... I believe University of Dar es Salaam, probably you have your charter, right? But you must have statutes as well, right? Statutes for each... In those statutes, the debate and discussion about how do you incorporate these issues that we're talking about academic freedom, is always important. Lastly, on that point, who was it who gave us the example of Wamba Diawamba about the flies? It was Kamata. Again, academics are always being. I mean, right now, Kakuru is telling you. In fact, it's not just his appointment problems, but even censorship in terms of the being withdrawn from the university listserv, right? Oh, we're going to withdraw these guys, So pressure from within, right, may not be helpful in that kind of situation. But if somebody from Dar es Salaam says, Mr. Vice Chancellor, we've heard that you've removed the president, the chairperson of the Makerere University Staff Association from the listserv, because now the listserv, that's the tool of mobilization, or the WhatsApp group, or whatever. Those micro measures of what? censorship. I think that the Wamba example, that a fly, a fly that operates alone doesn't succeed, but bees who operate together will. To say, look, this is what you're doing to your academics, surely you should be ashamed. And like Issa was saying, today these guys are academics. All of our vice chancellors, all of our DVCs, all of our registrars. 30 years ago, these people would be appointed from State House. The Makerere University's first vice chancellor was Obote's secretary, Frank Kalimuzo. But there's been no better vice chancellor since that time. So really, this question of the enemy within, I think, really needs to be seriously addressed. So self-mobilization, I think, is very important. And again, this relates to the question of sacrifice. In fact, Godwin, Mazrui not only debated Akena Doko, Mazrui debated both Milton Obote as president and Idi Amin as president. So, Idi Amin once came to the university and said, you students, in Uganda, you have freedom of speech. But freedom after speech, Sijui. Freedom after speech, I don't know. All right? You have freedom of speech, but freedom after speech. Now, in that kind of context, how do you debate with such a man? But Mazrui did. What am I saying? With any rights question, it's a question of struggle. It's a question of struggle, ultimately, whichever right we're talking about. And the right of academics, the rights of intellectuals, the rights of the so-called thinking and chattering classes. That's the only way that we can survive, right? We build on the sacrifices of those who went before us, right? Speaking from Mwasa's, you sleep away from your home. You go into hiding undercover. There are all sorts. So there's sacrifice, and unless we are prepared to recognize that academic freedom is part of that broader struggle, I'm afraid we will become extinct as academics. We'll become something else. We'll be taken over by we'll become the civil service in its most traditional sense. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. And another round of applause for Joe. On East African level, after the workshop on academic freedom, UDASA followed up with another workshop as a follow-up, which is also funded by CODESIA, again at our own initiative. And there the main topic of discussion was East African level. Remember, we used to East Africa Social Science Conference, which was amazing, okay? And I believe that one of the discussions there was to revive this sort of East African cooperation. So I think working at East African level is still possible. One of the biggest mistakes I think Malimu made was to give in to dissolve University of East Africa. I think we made a biggest mistake, okay, and go for these national universities. To this day, University of West Indies exists. Anyway, thank you very much, and we have gone beyond our time, but I think it was worth. Some of the discussions will continue, and let's start thinking in terms of real action and how we organize ourselves. At the end of the day, two important issues: organize, struggle. Thank you very much. Break for tea?
I'll take care. Thank you. Wow, that was heavy. So we're supposed to break for breakfast. Initially, it was 10:45. Then it was 11:15, and now it's 11:48. So we need to have an agreement. How much time are we going to spend for breakfast? Because now we want to break. I don't even know if it's breakfast anymore. It's brunch or or lunch all together. So I'll suggest maybe 20 minutes. If that's agreeable, then we... Is that correct? Let's... Yes, Kamada. Wow, that's even... yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so, but how many minutes we need?